Hello everyone, today we're going to create a simple atmospheric scene based on this reference photo. These are the materials we're using today. Please see more details in the description down below. Okay, let's start by doing a simple sketch. First, I'm going to determine where I'm going to place the bird. And here I am going to apply the rule of thirds, and I'm going to place the bird in the left third here. So I am going to lightly sketch out the shape of the bird, its reflection, and there's some other darker reflection, maybe rocks in the water. The reason why I choose this reference photo is it's so simple, and you can even paint it black and white, because the silhouettes of the bird, its reflection, the rocks and the rocks reflections are just darker, and then the surface of the water is lighter. They're mainly just two tones here, and you can be very creative. You can basically paint the water in any color you want, just to see whether they work out or not. Okay, I've done the sketch, and now I am going to wet both sides of the paper. So I first spray some water onto it so that I can speed up the process, and then I use a Haki brush to evenly wet the entire surface of the paper, and then I move on to the front side. The same thing. Just make sure you evenly wet the surface of paper so that it adheres to the board. The board I'm using is called Gatorfoam Board. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing it correctly, and you can find the description down below. And it is very good for stretching watercolor paper. One of the main colors I'm using is yellow ochre from Schmincke. I just want to try it out. You can choose any yellowy color in your palette. It is a very vibrant, semi-opaque color. And I think maybe I want to add a little bit orange. So I'm choosing this Cadmium Red Deep from Hobein. It was already in my palette, but it's used up. So I'm adding a little bit more and just adding a little bit in my mixture to make it more orange looking. I think I'm fine with this mixture, so now I'm going to apply it across the paper. As long as your brush strokes are almost horizontal, you're fine. And you can always make it more variant by adding a little bit more orange here and there. I put a tape underneath my board so that it can encourage the blending of the colors better. It doesn't have to be completely smooth because on the surface of water there are ripples and lines. So here I'm adding a bit more cadmium red just to make the surface of the water more interesting. And here we are painting the lightest layer of the painting, and then later on we're gonna make it darker. As you can see, now I turned my brush around and using, I don't know how to call this, the blade of it to make thinner lines to represent ripples on the surface of the water. So you can just play around with your brush to see what kind of brush strokes you can make. I think I am happy with this layer. And now I am going to clean off my brush and use French Ultramarine to make a darker layer. Blue and orange are complementary colors, so when you mix them together, you can get different shades of gray depending on the temperature of the colors. So as you can see, once I apply French Ultramarine onto this orange yellow layer, it turns a bit grayish. When you're applying this layer, you have to make sure that your blue is not very, very watery. It has to be thicker than the previous layer so that you don't create cauliflower. As you can see, I am adding a bit more cadmium red to my French ultramarine to make the gray tone darker. As you can see on our piece of paper, there are already a lot of different shades, but so far we've only used 3 colors. So you can really make a lot of mixtures of colors using a very limited palette. Okay, I think I'm fine with this layer. I don't want to overwork it. Now I'm moving on to the dark rocks and their reflection. And to make it darker, I am using Payne's Gray, which is some leftover from previous painting. And as you can see, I didn't make my pencil sketch dark enough. So after applying these layers of paint, I couldn't really see any of the pencil marks. So now I just have to draw with the brush. So a lesson to learn here is if you need guidance from pencil drawing, then make sure that you press harder once you've already sketched out the outline so that you don't lose it if you are applying especially opaque colors. But you can always be adventurous and just go without doing any pencil sketch because this is a really simple reference photo. So it's always nice to practice painting directly with your brush because it's just a good practice, you know. Now I'm switching to a smaller pointed round brush to paint the details. And here you don't really need to distinguish which part is the rock itself and which part is a reflection because here it's just a darker and so just make it variant interesting and make sense visually. And here I'm using very thick and dark paint because it will dry up lighter. So make sure it's really dark so that we have enough contrast for this painting. I think that's enough. I don't want to draw too much attention to these reflections because the focal point is the bird. Since now I have to go and draw the bird with my brush, I have to make sure that it is positioned above its reflection on the left third of the paper. The brush looks quite big for painting the bird, but because it's very pointed, I can actually paint the entire bird with this one brush, except for its beak. The suggestion is always trying to get the shape of the bird with as few brush strokes as possible. That's why we're using a bigger brush, and then fine-tuning the details with the tip of it so that it looks more fluid and natural. If you just trying to fill the shape in with very, very small brush strokes, and it will look dull. See, I can make very fine lines with the tip of the brush. Now I'm painting its reflection in the water. Just make sure the reflection is directly underneath the bird, but because it's reflection, it's not um, the edge is not as smooth as the silhouette of the bird itself, so you can play around a little bit here so that it looks like a reflection in water, not reflection in a mirror. Now I need to draw the beak and its reflection, so I need to switch to a very, very thin rigger. Try to make the beak in one go because it is really fine, doesn't really allow you to make a lot of touch-ups. And its reflection in the water is actually bent by the water, so you just make some zigzags, trying to make it look more fluid. Now I'm just filling in some gaps, make sure it to look like a solid reflection of the bird. With such a tiny brush, you can still make some fine touch-ups here and there, but make sure not to overwork it and ruin your painting at this last stage. But what's a big deal if you ruin it? It's just a piece of paper. Since this brush is really fine, so I'm struggling to make the marks. That's why you're seeing me like making strokes so many times. Okay, now I am looking at my painting and compared to the reference photo. I think it's almost done, except for one tiny detail. You probably can't see um, here, but there's some very bright reflection underneath um, the bird's, I don't know, bottom and its reflection. So I am going to use white zinc gouache, which is opaque, to um, paint that very bright reflection, since we didn't leave that unpainted, but that's not a problem. And here you need to use gouache rather than white watercolor because it's much more opaque. And it won't, the white won't be as bright as painted white paper, but for such a tiny piece of painting, it's much more manageable if we just add some white back to the painting instead of leaving it out. And that very bright spot is not entirely white. There's some orange to it because it's kind of like the reflection of the water. So I'm also adding a little bit cadmium red deep we used earlier, which is opaque, so it will also show here. And I didn't mention earlier, I'm actually switching to a slightly bigger brush because the previous one is too thin. I think this is done and we just need to sign. Here is the final painting. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to click like and subscribe.